Welcome to the Chosson and Kallah Shmooze you wish you had but never got, part 16. I remind everybody to kindly review and look at all these discussions in their proper order. This is highly sensitive matter. You cannot skip steps. If you do, you're not preparing yourself or giving yourself the proper foundation to understand what we have here in front of us, what we're trying to study and learn about. It's really forbidden to teach these things in a public forum. The Mishnah in Chagiga says that it's really only supposed to be in a dialogue between one person and another. So I ask you to treat this like I am just talking to you, whoever it is that is listening. But please listen to it in order. The easiest way to find it is to go to my YouTube channel. You just Google Simcha Feuerman and YouTube, and then on that channel there's a playlist. And the playlist has the Chosson and Kallah Shmooze you wish you had but never got. So you'll be able to start from the beginning, and it's all linked and it follows in order. Today we're continuing our discussion about the tension we find in the Gemara, and today we'll see in the Poskim about the value versus problems associated with sexual pleasure. And there seems to be a tension here, because on one hand it's a mitzvah to give pleasure to your wife, and we also discussed earlier, I'm not going to review it, we discussed earlier conceptually it may also be that there's a mitzvah to have pleasure as well. We'll have a chance to see more about that in later discussions. And on top of that, most mitzvahs are in essence meant to be enjoyed, and make no mistake, as we have seen earlier too, there's a mitzvah to be sexual even if it is not for procreative purposes. There's a mitzvah, as we saw, even to hug and kiss and engage in other forms of romantic closeness. So we're going to take a look at the way in which the Shulchan Aruch seems to deal with the issues, deal with what's taught in the Gemara and the Dharm, which we had already seen and discussed, and also see what the Ramah and then what other Nosakalim say about the whole matter, because it is cloaked in mystery, confusion, paradox, and contradiction. And as I've mentioned, and we'll talk about this later on too, this is the essence of Torah Sheba'al Peh. The more impossible and the more delicate the material is, the more it will be cloaked in contradiction, and the more it will be unclear. And that's because it was never meant really to be written down. And not only that, it's not like they're deliberately hiding it, although there are those that do deliberately hide their information, like the Rambam, who writes in his introduction to the Guide for the Perplexed, that he will deliberately hide what he's saying within contradictions and paradoxes and veiled references. But it's not even that, it's that the contradiction becomes the container for holding an idea that neither pole could fully express. In other words, if in the Torah there's this concept of one should practice abstinence and abnegation from pleasure, and then there's also this concept of one should enjoy pleasure, maybe both of them aren't true. Maybe there's some truth that lies somewhere between the tension of the two poles, and maybe it is not verbal. Maybe it cannot be given over so easily. You know, as we know, Rav Kahana in in Brachas Samach Beis, he went and stayed underneath Rebbe's bed to understand how his master conducts himself in the bedroom, and he was quite surprised, actually. We'll eventually discuss that interlude as well. But the point is, the fact that all this is unclear is necessarily so. And even I can only approach a certain limit. I can only give over to you some of the matters that seem to speak from the text and from the latent contradictions. But in truth, it is something that is a part of Torah Sheba'al Peh, and will remain so. So let's take a look at the Mechaber. The Mechaber in Orach Chaim Siman Reish Mem 240, the Rav Yosef Karo says that even when one is engaging in sexuality with his wife, so he's permitted to do so, and it's not a problem. This is on the heels of a discussion of forbidden types of sexual behaviors. He says that you should not be frequent by her And you should, well, let's say, not so much not be frequent by her, or that'll come later. He says you should not intend for your own pleasure. No, you should only be ka'adam shepareach chovo, like somebody who's just fulfilling an obligation, and to fulfill the mitzvah of Hashem. So that he'll have children that will study Torah and keep mitzvahs in Israel. He also can have in mind to make the child form better in the last 6 months, because there's a belief that sexual intercourse seems to help the formation of the child from 6 months, for the last 6 months. And then he says also, if you really feel that the only way to manage your lustful feelings is by being sexual, and you see that you're feeling a lot of lust, you also can be sexual. And the Ramah adds, and that also is worthy of reward. And then the Shulchan Aruch continues saying, but it is better that you should push off your Yetzer Hara, because a person has a small limb, as we saw on their body, that small limb, if you starve it, it's satisfied, and if you satisfy it, it is starved. And so he's saying basically that indulging in sexuality is dangerous, and that it will cause you to desire more, and it will lead to sin. This is essentially a paraphrasing of the Raavad and Bali HaNefesh, who talks about different levels of intention for sexuality, and we could perhaps see more about that at a different time. We go on to basically say that, furthermore, the Mechaber says that one should conduct oneself sexually with fear and trepidation, like it said about Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar was none other than the person we saw in the Gemara Nedarim, whose wife described his behavior, that he behaved as if he was forced by a demon, and as if, and he only revealed a tefach, a handbreadth, and then covered up a handbreadth. Now, there's a lot of question over here. The Mechaber tries to figure out exactly what that means, but all the interpretations that he gives involves limiting the pleasure, perhaps even limiting the amount of time. And that's really odd for a number of reasons. It's odd because, first of all this is being described is clearly going to impact on the woman's sexual enjoyment. And we had seen that it is a serious, heavy-duty major mitzvah to provide sexual pleasure for your wife. So how in the world is this going to be romantic and be pleasurable? And what's even more perplexing, and this really is troublesome, the Raavad himself raises this question of, didn't it say in the Gemara, which we had seen, the Gemara Nidan Lamed Aleph on 31, didn't it say that it is a mitzvah to literally tarry on the belly, shoha al habeten, in other words, to engage in sexuality for a long amount of time in order to cause the woman to have her pleasure, to have her orgasm. So the Raavad himself has a problem with this, and he says, well, basically, since your intention is l'shem shemayim, because you're worried that you might have some type of stray thought about another woman, and so you need to rush through the sexuality, and your intention l'shem shemayim, everything will work out. This is highly problematic, because even if someone could be zocha to such a level, we have a problem where you're actually thwarting the intention. The intention is specifically to lengthen the amount of time of intercourse in order to give the woman pleasure. Rushing through it, it's hard to imagine how someone would have siyata d'shmaya. However, we can only ask questions. This is what the Raavad says, and essentially the Mechaber endorses this practice. So we have a situation where basically the Mechaber is saying that the highest level is to do sexuality in a way that your pleasure is extremely limited, and even if not that, certainly one's attitude should not be to satisfy their lust, and one's attitude should be that he's only doing a mitzvah and he's doing a l'shem shemayim. So that is a very tall order. Now, interestingly enough, the Ramah, Rav Moshe Isserles, who we know is the Ashkenazic authority that appended onto the Shulchan Aruch his thoughts and comments as well, because he wanted to represent the halacha and the customs of the people of Ashkenaz, without completely ruining the fabric of Shulchan Aruch, so he added it onto Shulchan Aruch instead of making a whole new sefer. He brings up a different approach. But it's interesting, this is mentioned in two places. These halachas are mentioned both in Orach Chaim, in Siman 240, in Reish Mem, and it's also mentioned in Even Ezer, in Siman 25. Now, Even Ezer is about the legal requirements of marriage, and Orach Chaim is more about the ethical ways that one should conduct oneself. And it's significant because the Ramah, Ramosh Isserles, only comments in Even Ezer, not in Orach Chaim. And the reason why he does this quite clearly, as you will see, is that he essentially agrees with the Mechaber. He essentially agrees with the Mechaber that it is lofty and it is an ideal and a goal to aspire and to fulfill all these self-abnegating intentions. However, and that's why in Orach Chaim he doesn't say anything, because that has to do with the ethical matters. However, in Even Ezer, when he's dealing with strictly the legal requirements of marriage and what's forbidden and what's permitted, he adds the following powerful statement. He says, one may do with his wife whatever one wants. He can be sexual in whatever way he wants. He could kiss any limb that he wants. He can engage with her according to the usual way or according to the non-usual way. Even he can engage in sexual activity involving rubbing his organ or her organ anywhere over their bodies. No problem whatsoever. It's completely his choice. It's permitted, as long as he does not waste his seed. That's the first opinion that the Ramah records, meaning that as long as the ultimate intercourse, as long as it ends with intercourse and there is the zera going into the woman's body, then you have not wasted your seed. It doesn't matter whether or not she can become pregnant or not, because it's permitted to be sexual with somebody who cannot become pregnant. That's not the problem. The problem is that it's considered wasting seed if it's not through the path of intercourse. And that's why he comes to another position, following the Ri and Tosfos. In Yevomis, he says, and there are those who are even lenient, even having sex in the unusual way. Now, Shaloka Darka, from most sources, seems to be anal intercourse. And he says, even if he ends up ejaculating in anal intercourse, and he does it only on occasion, it's permitted. Now, there's a whole discussion. What does on occasion mean? In point of fact, though, the logic is compelling, because what the Ri and Tosfos is dealing with and what the Ramah is following over here is that since, let's understand something, it's considered masturbational when you waste seed, but we cannot define wasting seed as having sex in order only to get pregnant, because it's a mitzvah to have sex even with a menopausal woman. It's a mitzvah to have sex even with a pregnant woman. So we cannot define wasting seed as simply not reproducing. What we have to understand is there's something that's called derech bia. There's something that's called through the way of intimacy, sexual intimacy. Now, the only question is how we define that. So the strictest opinion would say only regular intercourse. One must ejaculate through regular intercourse, because that is considered the way of sexuality, derech bia. On the other hand, there is a possibility, let's say, that anal intercourse, since it's still some form of intercourse, is considered also derech bia. And even more interestingly is there's a prisha over here on the Torah, Siman Chafhei, number 31, Lamed Aleph, where he understands that any type of physical intimacy, that there's touch and they both are being engaged together, that this is also not considered wasting the seed. Again, though, it needs to be ba'akrai. It needs to be on occasion. Why on occasion? Because if it's more than on occasion, then the intention would be actually de facto birth control, which would be wasting the seed. So it's complicated. Meaning, if through the act of arousal and intimacy and sexual excitement, either the ejaculation occurs inadvertently, or even for some reason right now it's very pleasurable, this type of behavior, and there's some kind of ejaculation, they're saying that if the intention wasn't specifically to thwart pregnancy, it's considered the way of sexual intercourse, and it's considered permitted. But remember, and we must look at this much more closely in the next discussion, the Ramah is certainly in favor, strongly in favor, of abnegation and of limiting one's pleasure. So we have something where the technical halacha, according to the Ramah, permits all kinds of sexual behavior. Now, there's also a discussion when he said you can kiss anywhere. Did he mean really anywhere? Again, there's discussions and arguments about that. But the plain meaning is everywhere. And the question is, how do we reconcile all of this and figure out what is the right way to actually behave?